that you shouldn't really fear someone who's practiced a kick 10,000 times. Who you really need to be afraid of is that person who's practiced several kicks 10,000 times randomly. So 10,000 because, popular in motor learning area is the 10,000 hour rule. And also important because I guess Bruce Lee's prominence in all things motor skills related to martial arts. I will point out, though, that his idea of a man learning one kick 1,000 times is totally against motor learning theory. Importantly, we know now that even if you were to perform just one kick in a fight against Bruce Lee, you actually better learn a whole bunch of kicks because humans learn through variability. And my experience with sport as a youngster playing basketball, I could say my coaches knew that. So they didn't just teach me basketball free throw. They taught me to shoot from different areas around the basket, which is a good thing. They knew to introduce variability in my practice. So they didn't heed Bruce Lee's, advice of only having me shoot from one spot 10,000 times. They had me shoot from several places. However, and this might relate to your own experience with any motor skill training, whether it's sport or occupational, the way that the variability in these skills tends to be taught is, for example, here, you're going to do, 20 shots from the free throw line, one after the other, and then you move to the next location, 20 shots from that location, move to the next location, 20 shots, so on and so forth. That's the common paradigm by which we learn variations in motor skills. Now, in this talk, why I think you should listen to me and what I've got to say is, first of all, that practice that you engage in does not necessarily guarantee that you're going to get learning from this. So just because you do 10,000 hours of practice does not guarantee that you're going to derive learning outcomes from those 10,000 hours. The other point is you should not prioritize rapid performance improvements in your practice. We all love to improve quickly. It gives us a lot of motivation. It makes us feel special. However, as you'll see, prioritizing rapid practice improvements usually comes at a long-term cost. And then finally, you should be aware of that however you design your practice, it has to be representative of future neurocognitive demands. And just because you are proficient in practice using shortcuts does not necessarily mean you're going to derive long-term benefits. Case and example, I present to you the contextual interference effect, which John B. Shea first brought over from the verbal memory domain over to the motor learning domain back in 1979. Using an antique piece of equipment that you see here illustrated, basically 6 hinge levers, and the job of the performer was to hit a sequence of those hinges based on a stimulus presented to them. So there was 3 different variations represented by the different sequences by which you had to hit the levers, and we'll call those ABC, let's say, and each were signaled by a different colored light. Now, one group got to experience the typical way that variable skills are taught, which is the block format, right? It's like shoot from the basketball free line, 20 shots, then move on to the next, so on and so forth. So this block practice format is described as including low contextual interference, because if you look within a set of trials, you're going to be doing the same variations. So there's little contextual interference there. The other way that you could practice the 3 variations is to do it randomly. So instead of A, then B, so on and so forth, you're going to actually continuously face a change in motor skill variation from trial to trial. More importantly, you can't predict what variation you have to perform in the next trial. That's the why it's called random. So we call this high contextual interference because from trial to trial, you're going to face a lot of interference between the variations that you face. So which is the better way to train? Well, here are the results that I've illustrated from their 1979 report. Performance is measured here as a combination of reaction time plus movement time. So it's got an action planning plus execution delay component. And if you just look at the left side, the practice trial performance, you can clearly see that the block practice group outperformed the random practice group. I mean, even in the first block, they're already achieving high levels of success in terms of speed of performing the barrier knocking sequence. If you were to stop right now and go, which is the better of the two, you'd go, well, block practice. I mean, low contextual interference makes me feel like it's kind of easy, and I'm hitting really fast metrics, so I'm acing this thing. I'm feeling good. Now the problem is this is only temporary performance. We don't really know whether this practice performance reflects how much you've learned and, importantly, how you're going to perform in the future. So they introduced what we call delayed retention tests. There's a period you don't get any practice, and then we're just going to test you on this. And what we can see now is a completely different story. If you previously practiced under low contextual interference, look how much you've lost in your performance. You actually are performing worse at retention than you ever were in practice. Whereas those who practice in a random fashion or high contextual interference, hopefully you can see that they pretty much retain the level of performance that they achieved at the end of practice. And it's this interesting flip between practice and retention, which is the hallmark of the contextual interference effect. Remember, in both cases, the learners are being exposed to variations of the motor skill. The only difference is how that variation is scheduled in practice. So how does this thing work? Well, currently we have two leading explanations. The first one is a memory processing account called the elaborative processing hypothesis. And it goes like this. If you're in block practice or low contextual interference, imagine at any one time in your working memory, you only have one variation of the motor skill. So all you can do in terms of working memory processing is what we call intra-task processing. That's really low-level processing. However, if you are facing high contextual interference, where in a temporally proximal manner, you have the three variations that you're being exposed to, that information is coexisting in working memory. And what that means is now you can do deeper processing, not just intra-task, but also inter-task processing. And the argument of this hypothesis is that through the additional inter-task processing, what you end up with is a more elaborate motor memory representation of tasks that allows you to sustain your performance in the long term. An alternate account focuses on the action planning process. So once you receive a stimulus, you have to plan the motor commands, and then you're going to send them down your spinal cord to effectively produce that action. Now, if you imagine you're in block practice in a set of the trials, you're only getting variation A. Imagine after the first trial, you don't have to really plan that action anymore because you already did it. And you have the solution for that action plan in your working memory. So the solution just persists there, and you're able to respond really fast in practice because you're just pulling the solution out of working memory. However, if you're in random practice, because of the trial-to-trial changes, information that you have in working memory, or the action plan specifically, from the second trial, where you're facing now C, for example, no longer can be relied on the previous trial, which was B. So you have to now reconstruct the action on every trial. And the argument of this hypothesis is because random practice encourages you to reconstruct the action plan on every trial, you're getting more opportunity to develop that reconstruction processes, and therefore you're going to be more efficient in the long run. I propose a new account, which has really received nil attention, no pun intended, in the theoretical accounts for the contextual interference effect. Attention must be part of the contextual interference effect. Why? Well, attention is an important early process, just about any human behavior you can think about. But if you look at, for example, someone who's practicing a motor skill under high contextual interference, and they're going to have multiple pieces of information from those variations in working memory. And on every given trial, let's say on the trial that we're on right now, we're supposed to be producing variation A. Well, we've got a little action process demand situation here. Number one, you've got competition from the temporally proximal variations, C and B. So you've got some attention competition. You have some attention inhibition requirements because you're going to have to inhibit any attention that you had. For example, do I hit the first barrier or the second barrier, so on and so forth. And thirdly, you also have to be flexible. You can't be hanging back in trial N-1 focusing on C. You have to bring your attention in the moment and focus on A. So is there any support for the idea that I'm proposing to you that under high contextual interference, you're going to have higher attention demands? And my colleagues at Texas A&M University demonstrated this using a dual task paradigm. If you're not aware of the dual task paradigm, you have a primary task, which for us would be performance of the motor skill under high or low contextual interference. And then we use a secondary task, in this case, a probe reaction time to an auditory stimulus to measure attentional load. So the idea is if you slow down on the probe reaction time, that's interpreted as meaning that the primary task consumes more attention demands. Interestingly, they captured those demands in the pre-response, so the action planning stage, and also in the intertrial interval where supposedly you'd be doing some memory elaboration processes. And what you can see from the graph on the right, that I've taken from their paper, is that in both cases, you see higher probe reaction times for random practice compared to block, suggesting that yes, indeed, random practice elicits more attention demands than block practice. But notably, those increased demands are higher in the pre-response state, suggesting that action planning attention demands are particularly heightened under random practice. So at this stage, what we're left with is, hey, random practice might require more elaborative processing or more action planning, and this is more attention demanding. So really what we're looking at here is block practice gets an easy ride through practice. Well, I'd like to argue that that's not the case, at least with respect to attention. So we already discussed attention demands under high contextual interference because you're going to have to be flexible in switching between task variations. But look above at low contextual interference, where your job is to ensure that you maintain the action plan in working memory for the variation you're currently practicing. If you lose that, then you're going to lose the advantage of block practice because you're going to have to do some action reconstruction. So I would argue that attention demands are likely high under even low contextual interference because now your responsibility or your goal is to maintain episodic information to allow it to persist so that you can use it in successive trials. And if we look at the cascade model of attention control, which brings to question whether there's even a difference between the idea of attention and working memory, we can think about, well, you know, maybe what we're looking at here is different demands and different types. So I would argue perhaps block practice is really emphasizing the episodic control, maintaining the same information in attentional working memory systems. Whereas the random practice is targeting more of the contextual control, being able to switch from motor skill variations from trial to trial. So the cascade model and also the thesis I'm presenting to you might suggest that block and random practice share equivalent levels of attention demands, but for very different reasons. So in a paper that just came out last year, we investigated this specific question of attention demands under high and low contextual interference. And we use methodology which measures neural demands or neural activation using near-infrared spectroscopy. Let me just walk you through the background there. So we use two-channel near-infrared spectroscopy. We put those sensors in a location that's specific to a region of interest, namely the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with attention and working memory control. If you don't know much about the FNIRS technique, that's fine, but basically understand that what we're looking at here is injecting light into human tissue. That tissue goes through skin, bone, and even goes into the cortical surface. And as we inject that light, then we also are going to see what light bounces back. And based on the absorption and the way that that's changed, we can infer the changes in the cerebral oxygenated hemoglobin and deoxygenated hemoglobin. So the principle at work here is called neurovascular coupling. Basically, when your the neurons have increased demand, then you're going to elicit increased vascularization delivery of oxygenated blood to that area. It's the same principle by which we use something you might be more aware of, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Indeed, fNIRS has been correlated to fMRI bold signal, such that an increased change in oxygenated hemoglobin, that change is relative to rest, correlates with increased fMRI bold signal. Conversely, decreasing change in deoxygenated hemoglobin correlates with increased fMRI bold signal. Basically, what I'm telling you is if you're interested in understanding is a neural area being activated more or less, well, more neural activation in that region is associated with increased oxygenated hemoglobin and decreased deoxygenated hemoglobin. So this is the pattern that we're looking for in our results. So our methodology was we used a computerized motor sequence learning task. We had 4 different sequence variations. It was bimanual, and there was 5 key presses that needed to be performed, and that was signaled based on numeric coding. So we didn't use spatial coding, but we used numerical coding for each key that needed to be pressed. So we had a sample size of 26 fairly young adults, mostly right-handed, 14 females. We gave them first some familiarization with the task just to make sure they understood the symbolic mapping of the stimulus to response. And then we put on the fNIRS system, and they either got allocated to learn the 4 sequences under low contextual interference, 1 sequence at a time, or high contextual interference or random practice. And then 24 hours later, we had them come back to the lab, and we replaced the fNIRS probes on the prefrontal area, and then we tested them on these 4 sequences. So for the fNIRS, if you know the EEG 1020 system, we put these roughly between the FP1, FP3 area for the left, and FP2, FP4 for the right. And these are areas that have been anatomically correlated with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, as well as the frontal polar prefrontal cortex, areas important for attention regulation. So the first question is to look at our behavioral data. Did we get the contextual interference effect? So here are mean response time, so how long it took you to initiate and respond and complete the 5 sequence key presses. And if you look at practice, as we would expect, block practice is doing this faster than random practice. And just to change the terminology here, repetitive practice is the other name for block practice, and interleave practice is the other name for random practice. And then in the second day, we brought them back to test them, and we still see the contextual interference pattern, namely, and especially in the first test block, random practice ends up with better performance than repetitive practice. But what we can see here, if you give block practice a little bit extra training, i.e. in a second test block, they improve. But please refer the second test block performance to their 12th training block. And hopefully you can see while interleave practice is roughly maintaining their level of performance, block practice or repetitive practice has suffered significantly. So all that time they invested in training has pretty much been lost. So over to our fNIRS data. And again, we're looking at this to see, number one, do we get increase in oxygenated hemoglobin, suggesting that these prefrontal regions are being recruited more than rest? And I've got the 0 line here. And so, yes, overall for both left and right prefrontal cortex, there's elevated oxygenated area, suggesting that relative to rest, this task elicited recruitment of that area. Makes sense. And then for the deoxygenated hemoglobin, where we're looking for decreases relative to rest, we see that again, the task is eliciting recruitment of the prefrontal area relative to rest. So what does that mean? The task elicits prefrontal area recruitment. That should be pretty obvious to us. Now the question is, do block and random practice differ? And the answer is no. The levels of recruitment of the prefrontal area are pretty much the same between the two practice formats. Now, looking at test, first of all, draw your attention to the oxygenated hemoglobin change. It looks like for both left and right channels, if you practiced previously under interleave or random practice conditions, pretty much similar activation. But what we found was for the group who had previously practiced under block formats or repetitive schedule, they had less recruitment of the right prefrontal area at test. Now, for the deoxygenated, we didn't see any hemispheric by practice group interactions. So what this leaves us is, while the two practice groups seem to fare equally in terms of left and right recruitment at training, at tests we see a different story. Namely, that the right prefrontal cortex seems to not have been recruited at tests similarly to those who previously experienced interleave practice. So what can we take from this study? Well, hopefully you would think about the whole reason that you want to practice is for future performance. And in motor learning research, we quantify that through test performance. So if you imagine in a future test, what you're going to require to perform these motor sequence is efficient action planning. Makes sense. And for this, you're probably going to need a more elaborative memory to allow you to be more efficient. But also you're going to need contextual flexibility. I mean, going back to my basketball practice days, I didn't have to just shoot from one location 20 trials in a row. It was constantly changing locations. So I had to be contextually flexible in how I shot a basketball. Now, going back from the future aim, you go back in time, if you think about block practice, yes, you can elicit increased cognitive control of your attention to maintain task variation in working memory. However, that's not consistent with what you're going to be doing at a test. So me shooting a basketball 20 times from one location forces me to, employ cognitive control so I don't lose that information from trial to trial. But that's not what I'm going to be doing in a future game scenario. Random practice, on the other hand, increases action planning and memory elaboration in ways that's consistent with how we're going to have to use these processes in future test scenarios. So coming back to the whole reason why you should be listening to this talk, first of all, don't think that just because you're doing quote unquote practice that you are going to be guaranteeing learning outcomes. Moreover, if you prioritize rapid performance improvements in your trainees or in your own training, i.e. using a block practice format, don't be surprised if you don't look too good in future performance. Finally, when you think about the ways that you are practicing, think whether the cognitive operations that you're demanding in your practice are representative of the future neurocognitive demands that you have, either in test or performance situations. And I very much contextualize all of these themes in sport, but the contextual interference effect is a general human learning and memory effect. And so these same principles apply to maybe something that's a little bit more immediate to you, which is your academic performance. Namely, students love to prioritize rapid performance by doing things like block practice of their quantitative or theoretical knowledge that they're studying. Moreover, students love to do things like highlighting and summarizing and converting the lecture notes into these fancy good notes things. But you have to ask yourself, on a future test, are you going to be highlighting, summarizing notes, all that kind of stuff? No. So really, you should devise your practice to more effectively represent your future performance on test scenarios. So back to the original concept here is don't worry about someone who's practiced one kick 10,000 times, namely because they have no variable practice and they've done block practice, namely. So they're going to suffer terribly. You'll clearly have the advantage on them. The person you should look out for is someone who has bought into the variable practice, right? Several kicks, and they practice them 10,000 times, not in a block format, but in a random format. Thank you so much for your attention, and I believe we have time for questions.
Hey, thanks. That was cool. That was actually the most professional lab meeting we've had in a very long time. So thank you for that.
No problem.
You'll all be able to apply this motor learning or learning principles to your studies, your sporting achievements, and to winning fights against Bruce Lee. Although at this point, I think I'd bet on you anyway. So, does anyone have any questions for Maarten?
I'd say beyond studies, also, maybe some students are really on this coding. Coding it's got a motor element, right? Because you're typing. But how do you select the right call, or syntax, all that kind of stuff? And the idea here is, you should be practicing that with variation. Like if you're doing R stats kind of stuff, there's always more than one way to get a mean or aggregate or whatever you're doing or produce a plot. And the idea here is to change up how you're doing that so that you can be more flexible. Also even, type fast. A lot of heavy duty coders are all about how fast can you code.
One of the interesting things that people always ask me is, well, what if I read or learn while listening to music? Will that have an effect? And they kind of seem to want some sort of associative conditioning, like a paired response, almost like a paired associate sort of response between the music and, whatever it is they're trying to learn, whether it's cognitive psychology or counseling skills or something. So you kind of feel like the advice would be, well, you need to listen to different types of music and you need to be perhaps doing more than just that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's those old studies where, do you learn more listening to acid rock or classical, and of course, parents get lulled into, hey, buy these Mozart for learning CDs because your kid will be a genius and all that stuff. I think the fundamental question is, in the future performance scenario, whether it's a test or a game or whatever, is there going to be music? If there's not going to be music, then that you're practicing in a way that doesn't represent future context. I'll give you an example of this. I had a friend who was on he was a pole vaulter, and he wasn't very good, and he was in the European tour, but he wanted to get into the 1988 games in Barcelona. So he wants a sports psychologist to see if he can get some tips, and the sports psychologist got him onto visualization, and just that little trick, took him from rank 26 to one of the top ranked in the US. He made the team, and he ended up medaling at the Olympic Games, and he ended up in the fight for bronze, right? So between 3 and 4, and it was all looking good, but the other person he's competing against had the home ground advantage because he was a Spaniard, and he didn't end up medaling. The Spaniard won, and he said, the one thing I forgot to not represent in my visualization is a crowd whistling. Because whenever he was running up to do his pole vault, the crowd was whistling. And he says, I didn't represent that in my visualization, and that detracted my attention.
I always just assume I'll be getting whistled at whenever I do something, so it wouldn't be an issue for me. Regardless.
Right, for very different reasons.
Clearly.
Yeah.
I know Scott is unmuted, so I'm going to stop my tomfoolery and invite him to ask questions.
Yeah, I just had a question about, you're talking about that. I know it's just a fun example of the 10,000 kicks thing, but you're saying like randomly or in a block, but there's something in between those two, like a not random, but not a block.
Yeah.
Is the randomness important, or is it not? Is it just variation that's important?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, Scott. Thanks for that. Let's just backtrack to this slide on the ways that you could practice, even going back to Shea Morgan's. So there's an intermediate level of contextual interference called the serial one. And the serial one does have the trial changes, but it's predictive. So you could go ABC, ABC, ABC. And as you'd expect, intermediate contextual interference gives you intermediate results. So not quite as good as random practice, but definitely better than block practice. So I think you're right. They're intermediate, but we should view contextual interference as a continuum, not absolutes. The other thing I should make you aware of is the CI effect doesn't always work. We know, for example, in children don't benefit from high contextual interference the way that adults do. And we might relay that to developmental differences in these areas that we rely on to derive those benefits. Namely, we know that in youth, the prefrontal area is still developing. The other way that this falls down is where you have a highly complex skill to begin with, even something like martial arts kicking, because of the coordination requirements. Highly complex motor skills don't benefit from high contextual interference. Probably, generally speaking, it's an overload principle. The task is already overwhelming. And on top of that, you're overlaying a more challenging practice format. And so applied research that looks at more real life skills that are more complex, the suggestion is a transition. So start off with blocked, right? Just to deal with that complexity. But then as you're preparing for future performance, then that's when you transition into the more random practice format that might be representative of how you'll perform in the future. Yeah. You have a good question, Scott. Yeah.
I was just responding to reviewers when your talk started, and Alex came and got me because I was distracted by it. But it was about contextual interference in children. And,
oh, wow.
And we did not find that. We did a paper in adults using fonts, changing fonts up.
Yeah.
And they had to learn this information and then tried it in kids, and it really didn't work very well.
Yeah.
And the reviewers want to know why. And we're actually struggling a little bit to explain the results because they were a bit of a mess. Whereas the adults, it was very clear.
Yeah.
But I had a second point, which was just when you were talking about the sports, I was thinking about me practicing golf, and that you sort of want low difference between your swings. It's like a sport where you don't want to change anything. And have they done things like that where you don't want to change, should you do block rather than? Because I actually play golf rather badly, and I do a sort of a random practice where I don't do many in a row, because I find it actually very draining to practice over and over. You start focusing on little things, and it's very interfering.
Yeah, I'd say, look, in sports skills where technique is utmost, golf, basketball, shooting, these types of things, they don't want to mess up the technique, right? And so it's quite common in golf practice to always have this, like if you go to a driving range, I'm going to use the same club, aim for the same distance, and then change clubs. I just don't want to mess up my technique, just get that locked in. And I studied golf. Believe it or not, at A&M, you had to take PE class. I studied golf. I was lousy at it, namely because I couldn't drink any beer to get better. I don't know how that works. That's another presentation on the effects of alcohol, inverted U relationship on performance. But the motor learning principle is you should be facing variability. Even if there is, let's say you assume, there is one correct technique, through a concept called differential learning, the idea is to expose a human to the variability, and out of that variability, they'll differentiate what is the best solution for me and for that mix of variation that I'm exposed to. Now, if you're a beginner golfer, I'm not saying you are, Scott, but if you are, again, you might be facing a very complex coordination problem that maybe you should be doing block practice at first. But then again, I'm thinking if you're really training to win, a Masters tournament, you're never going to hit the same stroke twice. And so why would you practice, one club at a time, that kind of thing? Why shouldn't you represent your golf practice in the way that you're going to be performing it in the future? And namely, where even the stakes are high, right? $10 million checks at stake, and people are watching you and all that kind of stuff. And if you play golf in You're going to be competing in Florida that there's gators on the green kind of thing. So, like back to, your original comments around not working with children, it's a complex thing. I think these are general principles that I'm referring to, and I wouldn't say wholesale, you should throw out block practice. And hopefully what my data shows you is maybe there is some advantage for block practice. You can't say that block practice straight away bypasses attentional demands. I've shown you data that suggests even in block practice, the attention demands are there. And based on our data, they're at an equivalent level to random. The issue is that the type of attention demand is not conducive to how you'll use attention in the future. So I think we should get away from this monolithic view of attention, right? And really understand that attention is a complex process that probably is represented by multiple things, whether you're trying to have information persist in working memory, or you're quickly changing the information source and load in working memory from time to time.
Cool. Thanks.
Do we have any more cognition and motor learning enthusiasts who would like to take an opportunity to learn from Maarten? Haley is unmuted.
Yes, I did have a question. I'm not sure if you mentioned this before, but what if the test format was in that like blocked format? Would random still have that like better outcome, or would practicing in a blocked way? I don't forget, you might have actually mentioned this, but
Haley, did you review this paper that I just?
No, I didn't.
Because you sound like one of the. No, it's an excellent point. I refer you back to the original Shea Morgan data. I'm only presenting you part of the retention test because this is when they tested the learners under random retention conditions, right? So it's kind of unfair to those in the block because now it's different. What I didn't show you is the retention test under block format, and now the differences collapse. So you're totally onto this excellent insight that maybe the advantage here is no so much of a practice versus learning. It's the encoding performance, encoding specificity idea you probably covered before. Again, it speaks to, okay, if you're going to be performing in a block format in the future, maybe that's the way to go. My argument is how many sports skills or academic skills do you really have to perform in a block fashion? And this even extends to, there's some criticism about how we teach maths in secondary and tertiary curriculum. It's blocked. Think about any undergraduate studies that you did. It's like, here's a concept. We're going to beat it up and down for this week and then never see it again till the exam. And then on to the next one. And they say, well, that's probably not beneficial for learning. But no, well spotted, Haley. You're right. The match between the practice format and the retention test format is pretty important.
Yeah. And back on your practical applications thing, when I was thinking of the question, I was really trying to think of a real life way that you'd be doing like a blocked test anyway, and like all I could think of was like assembly line stuff. But just it's a lot more common that you'd be doing random testing. So makes sense.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, manufacturing assembly, you've seen the video, they're doing one and the same thing over and over again. But even though overtly it looks like it's blocked, the question is it always the same? Humans, even a basic reaching kind of movement, we think, oh, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. If you actually quantify the coordination dynamics, no movement's ever the same because we can arrange our shoulder different, our elbow, wrist, all that kind of thing can be combined in different ways. Even though the action goal remains the same, actually we introduce variability, and you probably know that the neural system is inherently variable, right? And who has the same attention across a period of time? Everything's fluctuating. So inherently, I think the point I'm making is life is full of variability. And even if you constrain it to the most blocked kind of format, you're still going to have to deal with variability in some way or other.
Oh, yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Haley.
We probably have time for one more question if anyone wants to dive in.
If no one has a question, I would like to just point out that the year is 2022. This is something I really struggle with. I did my PhD on the contextual interference effect, and that was done in 1999. It's 2022, and we still don't have a reasonable explanation for this contextual interference effect. That to me is very disappointing. Like, if a coach says, well, what's the theory behind what you're telling me? And I'm telling you, well, we've got these two accounts. And they're, like any student in undergrad is like, well, which one is correct? Don't know. And as time has transcended, people like me come along and go, well, hey, I got my own new account for this, and thing just grows. So I'm so disappointed that something that's as generalizable across human learning and memory, we don't have a clear account, a theoretical account for why this happens. I mean, that just blows me away. And maybe it speaks to the degree of complexity of which human learning and memory is, or any animal learning and memory is. And not only learning and memory, but on top of that, the complexity of describing mind-brain interactions for movement, right? So if you're looking for funding opportunities, job opportunities, man, there's a, I would like to think it's low-hanging fruit. I'm not sure, but there's something here to tackle that the best minds, I guess, to date haven't been able to arrive at a generalizable explanation for this thing that called the contextual interference effect. Just a plug for any PhD interest, I guess, a postdoc interest or collaboration. Hint, hint, Alex, Scott.
Sophie
I just
seems
have
keen.
one question, Maarten.
Yeah, hi, Sophie.
Unfortunately, I'm already doing a PhD.
Never too late to
But,
change.
True. I was wondering, with the random practice, I did miss the start of your talk, sorry, but to what extent is it sort of surprising? Because I was sort of thinking that you could explain this maybe from a predictive coding perspective, in that when you're doing the sort of blocked practice, you're applying the same sort of predictive model and it's constantly getting affirmed. And there's evidence that suggests that when you're sort of predicting something, you don't necessarily need to take in and learn that information. But a prediction error, on the other hand, so something surprising or different, sort of leads you to take that information in. So I was thinking maybe that could relate, but I sort of try to relate everything I can to prediction, so it might not be applicable here.
No, I think, to break the logjam, this theoretical logjam I'm referring to, we probably need fresh insight, right? Because contextual interference is typically dealt with people trained in motor learning. So I would say predictive coding is not common, parlay in our area. And I would recommend, if you have some insight around that, and I'm happy to work with you, even something like a commentary or, I don't know, a brief theoretical paper to address this would be most welcome. And I would love to think motor learning folk get exposed to this idea of predictive coding. I will say, though, there is an overarching framework, which we call the challenge hypothesis. And it very much speaks to the level of information that we expose humans to in practice. So if you can imagine you're in a block practice format, AAAA, well, there's not much information there. And moreover, I presented to you chronometric data, but if we looked at error, it'd be a similar pattern. If you're in block practice, low error, and of course, error is important because that provides information to update representations and all that stuff. So what the challenge point framework says is that we should aim to challenge the learner at a level where they're being exposed to more information, producing more errors, right? So instead of aiming to practice such that we get 99% correct, which makes us feel great and we're doing this, we're competent in what we're doing, we should be aiming at a 65% error rate to have room for information. So while the predictive coding might need some explanation for this group, I think they would all relate to the idea of the level of information that you're providing. So random practice perhaps, A more generalizable explanation is the level of information where, for example, on the second trial, I can't predict what I need to do on this trial based on previous experience. Moreover, I'm more likely to produce an error, and that error is going to give me information that I can use to update for future performance. So, excellent point, and I would love to see Jono 2023, albeit a whole new explanation for the contextual interference effect.
Thanks, Maarten. Yeah, that's very interesting idea.
Yeah, if you want to explore that further, happy to chat with you.
Yeah.
Yep.
That would be great.
Yep.
All right, guys, why don't we call it there then? Thank you very much, Maarten, for coming and sharing your brain power, your expertise with us. So I can give him a muted clap, please. There we go. Maarten sometimes does pop in, so feel free to say hi to him. He's nowhere near as scary as he looks. And yeah, other than that, it was great to hear what you're up to, man.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Alex. Great to have the opportunity following the honors presentation thing. But thanks so much for y'all's comments and questions. Excellent. It's great to see that there's still interest in the contextual interference effect and people still applying it to their own interests, like golf, predictive coding. So that's excellent to see. Confirms to me that more work needs to be done in this area. Thanks so much. And yeah, hope to see you guys in person next time I have to stop over at the lab there.
We'll have some coffee ready for you.
Oh, nice, man. Excellent.
Cool. All right, guys, thank you for that. And I think next up is Sophie, in fact, who is going to explain contextual interference to us in great depth.
Through predictive coding lens.
Yes, we look forward to that presentation next fortnight.
It's actually me applying predictive coding to something else. So.
Oh, I better tune in, Alex.
I'll send you a link.
Yeah.
Oh, it might not be that good.
Postdoc
I'm just
recruitment for
interested.
Sophie.
How about I promise not to ask any questions, Sophie?
That would be good. No, I like the questions, Maarten.
Okay. I promise to ask very complex, in-depth, challenging questions.
That's what we're after.
Great.
In a random way.
All right, guys, thank you. We'll call the meeting. Maarten, I'll send you the recording.
Muchas gracias. Pleasure, everyone. Bye.
See you guys.